Netflix was launched in 1997, barely 4 years after the death of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, and it has had its fair share of fame, hits, and scandals since then. While the same can be said of Escobar, who sometimes drew fame, hits, and controversy in a single act. It's little wonder that when the two collided in 2015 with the debut of Narcos, fame and controversy erupted. If you haven't seen the show, this video contains spoilers on top of spoilers. Here are 10 facts about Don Pablo Escobar, Medellin cartel leader, first narco-terrorist, and richest criminal of all time that Netflix is withholding. Number 1. Narcos' original plan. According to the story, Netflix intended this drama to be a full-length feature film rather than a television show. When they started gathering evidence and researching the king of cocaine, they realized that a single film would not be adequate. They discovered various legends regarding the roots of his money, beginning with a man named Cockroach and his life before smuggling, which included gravestone theft. All of this, combined with the facts from first-hand experiences presented to the board by DEA officers Steve Murphy and Javier Peña, demonstrated to the producers that they knew nothing about Escobar. As a result, Narcos was born. Bernardo Aparicio Garcia, who grew up near Colombia, writes for Vox and praises the show's thoroughness. He emphasized, among other things, the accurate portrayal of ethnic diversity and the little elements such as miniature facades of colonial village houses hanging on the walls of Pablo's mother's home. Number 2. Escobar's recordings. One reason the show was so thorough was because of these recordings. Pablo Escobar was a huge believer in keeping records of events, including videoing events in his haciendas. With this, they could generate a very accurate representation of Escobar's daily talks, fashion style, and hobbies. While in the film, Escobar is mostly lounging about, brooding and staring into space. Contemplating how to make the next major move in his fights with his government, the fact is a little different. The Medellin cartel loved using media, as evidenced by the inclusion of some of his recordings in the show depicting the activity within his haciendas. Pablo would have enjoyed Twitter, especially because he was willing to purchase or kidnap news reporters to tell his story. Number 3. Family opinion. Of course, you had to expect this one. It's important because you have to wonder how much of the story and Pablo's interaction with his family was accurate, and how the Escobars felt about it. To answer your question, Pablo's brother was enraged by the show. If you watch the show, you're probably wondering where Escobar's brother was the entire time. In real life, Roberto Escobar was not only Pablo's brother, he was the cartel's accountant until his capture after Pablo's death. So believe us when we say that when the show featured another accountant named Blackbeard being caught and then snitching on the cartel to officials, Roberto was furious. In return, he requested a $1 billion payout from the streaming behemoth for using his and his brother's likeness without consulting him or other family members. He also offered to look through the second season for mistakes before its broadcast, although we're not sure how well that worked. Meanwhile, other family members have challenged Pablo's portrayal in the Palace of Justice siege, as well as the manner of his death, but we'll get to that later. Number 4. Pablo Escobar's gruesomeness. Watching the show, you already kind of get the impression that Pablo Escobar was one of the most terrifying guys ever to walk the Earth's surface. Even then, Pablo is primarily portrayed as a disturbed man in a loving relationship with his wife and children. In reality, Don Pablo was a drug lord through and through, according to first-hand testimony from informants. Sometimes, Pablo would drill into his enemies' kneecaps, if he felt like it. Also, a server was spotted trying to steal silverware during one of Pablo's parties, according to an informant. When Pablo learned of this, he decided to duct tape the person's hands and threw them into the pool, where they drowned as entertainment for the guests at the party. Number 5. M19's true nature. Most analysts will disagree with this part of Narcos. M19 was one of Colombia's largest guerrilla factions. They were extremely fearsome, and they knew how to strike terror. In addition, unlike his portrayal as Ivan Torres in the show, Ivan Marino Ospina, or Ivan the Terrible, was an experienced guerrilla leader. Before becoming the leader of M19, Ivan Marino Ospina had fought in Venezuela and had been arrested and tortured to the point of nearly committing suicide, only to escape 6 months later. He was known as Ivan el Terrible when disguised as an army major because he frequently conducted things less diplomatically. It's considered doubtful that Pablo murdered Ivan, and some even speculate that he did not give Escobar the legendary Bolivar sword. Number 6. Pablo's relationship with his family. Given that the man's family was not contacted despite their importance to the plot, it's only logical that their interactions with Pablo were imaginary, which is a risky approach to telling a story, especially if you already have pre-existing assumptions. Perhaps no other connection was as misunderstood as Pablo Escobar's with his son Juan Pablo, now known as Sebastian Marroquin. Sebastian is now out of the drug trade business and frequently speaks about his experiences as the son of the most powerful drug trafficker in several interviews. In these interviews, he explains how much his father loved him, whilst also balancing the picture with the consequences of his father's violent activities. "Well, you know, I learned so much about violence that I became a man of peace," he once said. Sebastian claims that his father taught him about all narcotics, claiming that marijuana was Pablo's favorite. Perhaps it was education, or the recollection of a relative who'd suffered from the repercussions of drug misuse, but Sebastian has never felt the need to take drugs. Number 7. Secrets of La Catedral. Netflix portrays Escobar's 5-star prison as lavish, with many of the drug lord's possessions, but it does not reveal all. Remember the tapes we discussed earlier? Even more, Escobar's stuff was hidden in the cathedral. In the show, Escobar leaves behind a big book filled with photographs. However, in Agent Murphy and Peña's book, Manhunters, they revealed that Escobar had every wanted poster ever issued against him in Colombia, and nearly every article. He also kept threatening letters from his adversaries. Escobar was meticulously organized, which was evident in La Catedral's bathrooms, which Peña describes as strangely sparkling with 3-inch walls. Still, perhaps the most shocking discoveries were the letters from mothers offering their daughters to Pablo for sex. Number 8. Carlos Leder's influence. Carlos Leder was the son of Klaus Wilhelm Leder, a German who moved to Colombia, changed his identity to Guillermo Leder, and married Helena Rivas, a Colombian. Carlos later moved to America with his mother after his parents divorced, and he finally ended up in prison, where he met a fellow inmate named George Jung. They would both plan how to modernize the cocaine trade and begin shipping drugs to the United States using small planes, so Leder had already started the company before meeting Pablo Escobar, and was even instrumental in Escobar becoming as wealthy as he was. Leder would become a billionaire, and even offered to pay Colombia's foreign debt twice, one of which was his escape plan. Unlike on the show, where Leder was basically a jerk who was ordered to quiet up in meetings and outed himself on national radio on a regular basis, the representation of his story in Fall from Grace was far from complete. Number 9. Escobar's suicide. If you know anything about Pablo Escobar's background, suicide must be an odd term to be associated with his death. But pay attention, and we'll see where this leads. Pablo Escobar killing himself is a claim made by close family members such as his siblings, and most crucially, his son Juan Pablo. You see, Juan Pablo was the last person Patron spoke to before he died, and he makes a compelling case for why he believes his father committed suicide. Consider his reasons. Juan Pablo claims that his father always told him the telephone was death. Don Pablo was well aware that the DEA, CIA, Center Spike, and police agents were monitoring the airwaves to triangulate the whereabouts of cartel members. Pablo Escobar spent very little time on the phone and instructed his kid to avoid using it at all costs. The second point is that Escobar's family had recently been denied entry into Germany and were forced to stay in a Colombian hotel owned by the armed forces. This indicates that Escobar's family was never safe wherever they went, and that the hotel phone lines were almost certainly tapped. Pablo must have been aware of these facts. The third point is that Pablo had trained his kid how to commit suicide in case they were apprehended. Juan Pablo claims that his father advised him to fire into the right ear rather than the mouth in order to avoid pain and die fast. Pablo's brothers confirmed that Pablo had stated that he would rather kill himself than be killed by the ones hunting him, because it was not going to be a pleasant way to die. With these facts in mind, let's relive Pablo's final moments. A certain Colonel Martinez and his son, Lieutenant Martinez, are using the directional tracking gear to try and find any phone connection. At the same moment, Pablo Escobar is on the phone with his son, Juan Pablo, discussing an interview that Juan Pablo is already aware of. Juan Pablo claims that his father called him 7 times. While trying to stop the conversation each time, he recalls complaining to his father that this was dangerous because their phone was most definitely tapped, and he was already aware of the matter being discussed. Juan Pablo realizes that his father is attempting to save them from interrogation by giving up himself while on the phone. Lieutenant Martinez is holding an antenna from the vehicle when he notices the King of Cocaine. They attack the house after the police had gathered adequate forces, and only then did Pablo drop the phone and say, "Something unusual is occurring here, I'll call you back." His bodyguard Limon is dead, and Pablo is shot on the roof multiple times before his body goes limp. On inspection, a bullet wound is found on Pablo's head. Guess where? That's right, the right ear. It's odd that he was discovered and murdered exactly 1 day after his birthday. It was almost as though someone wanted to have the last dinner, a proper last laugh. Number 10. Wagner Moura's pro-drug stance. Wagner played Pablo Escobar to perfection in Narcos. The Brazilian actor was praised for the performance and has become so associated with Escobar that his images appear when the drug lord's name is searched on Google. They do, however, share much more. Moura feels that drugs like cocaine should be legalized, and after acting like Escobar, he believes this even more strongly. This is because, in a world where cocaine was legal, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria would have been mostly recognized as a shrewd businessman. The latter became wealthy from nothing and gave back to the poor. Most of his ordered killings began with shutting down officials who wanted to lock him up or deport him. Do you agree with Wagner? Comment below.